With Endless Ocean, The Thousand Year Door and Luigi's Mansion 2 filling Nintendo's spring quarter, the time has come to peer into the great gaping mystery that is the back half of 2024. Eventually, there will be a Nintendo Direct, but when it comes, what will it show? Now, we've all got our wish lists and Nintendo is known for being hugely unpredictable, but this channel always aims to take a systematic and, where possible, data-led approach, even to something as hugely speculative as predicting future games. So, this video will approach this question in a specific way. First, we're going to break down the usual cadence of releases across a year to see what the gaps and the trends are. This will give us a basic structure to work with. Then we're going to look at the kind of games that will release in this period. Some franchises and companies are more prolific than others, and so some franchises we should be predicting more than others. Then we're going to consider which development teams have been quiet for a long time and try to really look at the full range of possibilities. Taken together, we might not predict the exact direct, but I think we can give a reasonably strong forecast on the broad direction of travel. One clarification about forecasting: a 90% forecast also means that I do think there's a 1 in 10 chance I'm wrong, and a 10% forecast means there's a 9 in 10 chance I'm wrong. In fact, when I review these forecasts to see if my judgments are right or wrong, I'm looking for my 90% forecast to be right 90% of the time, my 50% forecast to be right 50% of the time, and so on. In this sense, I'm not concerned with simply calling which games will release, fun than that would be, but being able to provide ranges of likelihoods that are broadly trustworthy. Okay then, first let's look at the slots we have available. We can bank on July, September, and 2 to 4 games across the October and November months. Sometimes Nintendo releases a December game and there's potential for an unannounced game still in the next few months. This, in many ways, is the most unpredictable option of all. This could be in the form of a shadow drop alongside the Direct itself, or else a game with a short hype cycle, releasing in the April to June window. With only 3 games announced for the April to June quarter, there might well be another title dropped in this period, and in fact this quarter has historically had quite a few games released here without much build-up at all. These tend to be on the ultra-casual end. This is the quarter when Nintendo especially likes to put out titles for a non-core audience. Everybody 1-2 Switch in 2023, Switch Sports in 2022, Game Builder Garage in 2021, and Clubhouse Games in 2020 are all recent examples of this trend. However, my hunch is that Endless Ocean scratches the itch of a casual title, and while they're not developing the game, they are publishing it. Therefore, I put the likelihood of another casual entry at just 30%. Another option would be a shadow drop. Twice in the last 2 years, Nintendo have shadow dropped titles during a Direct. I'm not talking, of course, about things like F-Zero 99, which are online games. I'm talking about retail titles. And it seems to me that this is the most likely way that we would get a new title in the coming quarter. In particular, if the Direct is indeed in April, that month currently does not have any major releases. And while it's not unprecedented for them to skip major releases in April, they didn't have any major release in consecutive years in 2018, 2019 and 2020 in April, only online titles like Box Boy and Good Job. A shadow drop, probably of a GameCube remaster, would make a lot of sense. With Mario accounted for in this quarter and Zelda unlikely to be dropped in this manner, we're probably looking at any of the smaller titles that would suck up attention during a fallow period for first-party titles. Now the net here is incredibly wide. Kirby has been conspicuously absent this year, and while that's not unprecedented, it is relatively unusual. Kirby's Air Ride would therefore be a possibility. Games like F-Zero GX and Wave Race Blue Storm also feel possible, although I feel like F-Zero GX could be saved as a graphical showcase for the next system rather than releasing on the Switch. Really, the list of possibilities here is too broad to consider each individually, but there is one that stands out: Metroid Prime 2 and 3 as HD ports. If Metroid Prime 4 is released this year, the Metroid Prime games could be released alongside, following the pattern of Pikmin 1 and 2 last year, but even if Metroid Prime is just heavily trailed, it would make sense to have the existing Prime games out in the holiday season during a relative lull as opposed to alongside a new console where they would be quickly overlooked. In an ideal world, I would hope Retro, Iron Galaxy and the team are working on full-fledged remasters after the absolute wonder that was Metroid Prime Remastered, but realistically, HD upscales are more likely for games that never quite had the same level of prestige and certainly not the same sales history as the original GameCube classic. This again makes more likely a release in the next 12 months, and I'd say there's a 70% chance we'll see Metroid Prime 2 and 3 before the end of the 24-25 financial year, and a 50% chance we'll see them by the end of 2024. Excluding Metroid Prime games though, if we go by the baseline frequency of how many General Directs recently involved dropping major first-party titles, I think there's a 30% likelihood for any Shadow dropped remaster in this Direct, and there's a 70% chance that we'll see a remaster of some description shadow dropping or dropping within 6 weeks of a release in the calendar year of 2024. Now, July is a popular slot for Nintendo, and it's usually reserved for one of their bigger games outside the holiday season. Historically, the slot has often been used for RPGs, Octopath Traveler in 2018, Fire Emblem Three Houses in 2019, Zelda Skyward Sword in 2021 if you count it as an RPG, and Xenoblade Chronicles 3 in 2022. Even if they're short on games in general, I think there's a 90% chance that a first-party title releases in July, and given this history and the very credible rumours of a Fire Emblem 4 remake being ready, I would say there's a 30% chance that the July slot is for Fire Emblem. This would be 18 months since the release of Engage, so a good period of time, but also Nintendo wouldn't want to scoop themselves by announcing a new game while the previous one is still selling perfectly well, so it makes sense to launch a new Fire Emblem title now with a short hype cycle. If not Fire Emblem, this slot previously was used by Zelda, and so either Wind Waker or A Link Between Worlds would be well placed here. Another option though would be a Warriors title. Nintendo-themed Warriors games have released in October 2017, November 2020 and June 2022. If you follow the pattern, it wouldn't be too surprising if there's another one this year. This gap is actually, relatively speaking, on the long side for them. While these games often chafe against the graphical power of the Switch, they also benefit from tying into previous games on the console. So for example, Breath of the Wild led to Age of Calamity, and Three Houses led to Three Hopes. Therefore, is there a possibility that there's another Warriors title that could release, perhaps even building off Tears of the Kingdom? I think it feels a little early for a Tears of the Kingdom tie-in though, and that does seem like the kind of graphical powerhouse game that Nintendo would want to showcase a new system with. As for Fire Emblem Warriors, that only released recently, and although I think there's a lot of interesting possibilities for a new Warriors title, I put it at a 10% chance that any will release this year. August is usually a fallow month for Nintendo. When games release, they are normally partnerships with third parties, Mario + Rabbids Kingdom Battle in 2017 and Astral Chain in 2019. Even then, these titles were in years with major new hardware launches and were usually towards the very end of the month. Japanese work culture is very intense, but Nintendo usually takes off the month of August, or at least a significant amount of it, and I anticipate that this year they will do the same. I give a 90% prediction that there will be no August title. This does mean that September is important for them, closing out a quarter which is relatively light on releases. Then October and November are the major windows to release games. Typically Nintendo has 3 releases during October and November, although last year actually had 4, though of course one was Super Mario RPG, which was created by Square Enix. December games are rarer, and usually that slot isn't used if there's any chance to put those games earlier on in the cycle. I think Super Smash Bros. Ultimate in December of 2018 was a significant December game, but my hunch is that it was probably only put there because they wanted to use every second of development time up until its release. Since all evidence suggests that the game lineup coming up is quite light, I think there's only a 30% chance of a December game, and I'd say there's a 70% chance that there will be 4 or 5 retail first-party releases, or at least titles from third parties using first-party IP, in the last 4 months of this calendar year. One complication to this forecast is that Nintendo recently has had some success shadow dropping remasters and following up again with physical copies later. They did this with Metroid Prime Remastered and then again with the Pikmin 1+2 games. If they're reliant on old games this year, it's perfectly possible that a retail game could end up with 2 releases. Hence I'm clarifying 4 or 5 retail releases as opposed to 4 or 5 games, as Pikmin 1 and 2 would count as 1 release, even though it is of course 2 games. But we're probably looking at for a September game, 3 games in October-November, and possibly a shadow drop with a physical release to follow. Let's look then at the big franchises. A Mario game has to be at least a 90% certainty. It's hard to imagine there being a holiday season without Mario, even if occasionally they've gone to third parties like Sega for Mario and Sonic at the Olympics in 2019, Ubisoft for Mario + Rabbids Sparks of Hope in 2022, or Square Enix's Super Mario RPG last year. The field is quite open in terms of what Mario we could get. It's been a long time since a Mario sports title was released outside of the June window, but Bandai Namco have been relatively quiet recently, and Mario Baseball would be an obvious game to bring over. Similarly, a port of either Super Mario Galaxy 2 or even Super Mario 3D Land would allow for the Switch to end with one more major Mario platformer, which in a relatively light year could be a really good sales boost for the company. If you check the video at the top of the screen, I've gone into a little more detail about the really big megaton games that Nintendo could release this year, including Super Mario Galaxy 2 or a new Mario Party title. My hunch is that Mario Baseball sits at about a 30% likelihood, Mario Party at about 30%, and the other possibilities at maximum 10% each, including ports of the new Super Mario Bros. Games or even the Mario and Luigi titles. Pokemon, though, is another 90% certainty. Now, I appreciate that many people feel the Pokemon Company would simply have announced any new holiday game in their Pokemon Day Direct, but these directs aren't some kind of blood oath that a company makes for what they're releasing, they're a marketing tool. If it doesn't benefit the company to announce a game yet, they don't need to. Plus, they may well have felt that Pokemon Legends ZA deserves its own time in the spotlight, insulated from any other hype cycle. Now, Pokemon may still be able to get by with non-Switch fare like its mobile offerings or even some kind of DLC on a previous game. The Gen 1 Pokemon games on Nintendo Switch Online will be another way to garner attention, and I could certainly see those launching in the October window, particularly around the anniversary of a lot of people's renewals, considering that many people moved over to the expansion pack 3 years ago this October. Still, whereas Nintendo will happily miss out on holiday seasons to let big games stew that little bit longer, the Pokemon Company is ruthlessly schedule-oriented, and even if the gap was unexpected because, for example, there was an internal delay to the new system, I still find it difficult to imagine that they won't move heaven and earth to release something at retail this holiday season. The major missing studio for Pokemon is Spike Chunsoft of Pokemon Mystery Dungeon fame, a game that has yet to have an original entry on Switch. Now, Spike Chunsoft produce a lot of their own titles and have slowed down their rate of production recently, but they have a very long history with Nintendo. Still, given the 5-year wait after the last Mystery Dungeon, I'd stick a Mystery Dungeon at about a 10% chance. In fact, if Spike Chunsoft do anything for Switch this year, another 10% chance says it's a revival of Fossil Fighters. As for other port options like Pokemon Rangers, Creature spent absolutely ages developing Detective Pikachu Returns, which only returned last year, so I'd put this at a 10% shout. I also think a Gen 6 remaster, not a remake, but a bare bones 3DS upscale of X and Y, is an underrated prospect, but I've covered that separately. And then, of course, there's Zelda. Annual Zelda was a reality for a long time, but 2022 broke the pattern. Still, Zelda is an important franchise for Nintendo. On the one hand, it's difficult to imagine that they would want a major Zelda game to take the slot in the last days of a system. Surely they would want it for their new system, but when you consider that this new system is likely to be backwards compatible, and the precedent of Zelda Twilight Princess in the Twilight of the Wii U, I think there's a chance of a Zelda release, and that chance is probably about 70%. There are a few options. I know people are very keen on the idea of a Wind Waker Twilight Princess double pack, but I think this is hugely unlikely. These games are so tonally different, and even their age ratings way apart, which may make a difference to parents shopping for children in the holiday window. Plus, there's no need for Nintendo to devalue their remakes by packaging them together. So, if there's just one of these, I think it would have to be Wind Waker, and yet, I think Wind Waker benefited significantly from the map feature on Wii U. I don't know that the next system will have a way to generate a 2-screen effect, but if it were possible, Wind Waker would be far better served on that console than the Switch. Still, that technology may still be unlikely, and Wind Waker is such a low-hanging fruit that I put a 2024 release for Wind Waker at about 30% likelihood. Also, of course, we have A Link Between Worlds. 3DS ports going great guns at the moment, with Luigi's Mansion 2 HD following up Miitopia, and 2D Zelda champions Grezzo are masters at them. It's been 5 years since the last 2D Zelda, and it could be many more years if Nintendo want to focus on more graphically impressive Zeldas to start the new console off. Phantom Hourglass is another potential port, but I can't see any logic for it to precede Wind Waker's return, so I would rate A Link Between Worlds as a 30% possibility. And of course, there's the one truly gigantic title in scale, if not quite in sales history, that we know is definitely coming: Metroid Prime 4. It makes all the sense in the world for this to be a cross-gen title, but the logistics of that are tricky. Yes, it's a long-awaited title that will be a graphical powerhouse and has been a major development project, but on the other hand, selling it on the old hardware would guarantee a far larger install base. Metroid releases often come in September or October, so there would definitely be a game that would seize attention in this holiday window. On balance though, I'm putting it at just 30% chance for this year. Finally, let's look at some overdue publishers. Camelot have been quiet for 3 years, but unless they've been working on a Golden Sun title, their next entry in the Mario Tennis franchise will probably be kept on ice for the new system. That said, they could reuse their golf or tennis mechanics with a different title. Personally, I've always thought that Animal Crossing suits golf a lot better than Mario. I think Camelot having a new title this year is a 30% shout. Then there's Mages, who developed the Famicom Detective Club games, which released in 2021. It's difficult to gauge how successful these really were for Nintendo because of the lack of sales data, but it's possible to imagine they kept going and have either a remake of the obscure third Famicom Detective Club game from Satellaview, or another remake of a cult classic such as Shin Onigashima, or even an original game to show for themselves. I would put this at a 30% chance. Then there's Pushmo from Intelligent Systems. With Mario vs Donkey Kong being ported over, the time is surely right for small-scale puzzlers on the Wii U to make the jump, and Pushmo World is just begging for a port. Because it's been so long since the last Pushmo, the overall odds can't be that high, but the directors of that title, Tako Sugioka and Misuzu Yoshida, haven't directed any other title since Stretchmo and have received support and special thanks credits on other games, but haven't been majorly involved in their production. Therefore, I'm going to bump Pushmo of some kind up to 50% this year. I touched on Kirby before, but HAL has been very quiet. Usually Kirby games are reserved for the first half of the year, and since the last 2 years have had fairly major releases with Forgotten Land and Return to Dreamland Deluxe, a fallow year or two shouldn't surprise anyone. Still, 2011 saw the Wii's dying days, and of course that did have a holiday Kirby title, and Kirby was a more prominent feature of the 3DS's later years. I'm not sure they dive straight into another port after Return to Dreamland Deluxe, but HAL likes to dabble with smaller titles and spin-offs, so I'd say a Kirby reveal of some kind would be a 50% chance for 2024. Monolith Soft have been quiet for a while as well, and given the technical similarity of the Switch to the Wii U hardware, Xenoblade Chronicles X does seem very curious by its absence. Here's the thing though, if Monolith Soft want to do a sequel game on the new system, a classic Nintendo move would be to re-release the prior game on the prior system. Think Samus Returns on 3DS before Metroid Prime. I know it wasn't quite the prior game, but it was a previous title. Or Luigi's Mansion on 3DS before Luigi's Mansion 3 was announced. For this reason, I'm keeping a Monolith game as a 30% shot. Most likely Xenoblade Chronicles X, although of course they could have some other project. Ultimately, I think it's probably more likely that Xenoblade Chronicles X will follow the pattern of Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition on Switch, and they will release that version after they've done a sequel to X, if indeed they plan to do so. One title that for me has a 30% chance of coming out this year is Donkey Kong Country Returns. Metroid Prime 4 must surely be zoning on completion, and so for Retro Studios, if they have the spare development capacity, a Donkey Kong Country Returns game would make all the sense in the world. A new game would likely be the preserve of the new system, but Donkey Kong Country Returns would be simple enough to port that it would nevertheless do quite well, and of course Retro did work on the Tropical Freeze port in 2018. I just hope there's more extensive additions to it this time than a new funky mode. Another RPG team, Grezzo, are usually associated with 2D Zelda, but they also worked on the port of Miitopia, which by all accounts did fairly well. If Nintendo is looking for a major casual game for the holidays, they could do a lot worse than create a new version of one of the 3DS's bestsellers, Tomodachi Life. These sorts of games suit a large install base well, and we know the bulk of Grezzo's team must have been working on something besides their mobile title and a port or two. I think a new Tomodachi Life game by the end of 2026 is a 50% likelihood at this stage, but for this year, I put it as closer to 10%. For more on Tomodachi Life, please check out this video at the top. Next level games have been quiet for a couple of years since the disappointing Mario Strikers Battle League. Time was they could be relied on to make a game within a 3-year window, but since they were bought out by Nintendo, Mario Strikers moved a little faster. That said, they are, I am absolutely sure with 90% confidence, working on Luigi's Mansion 4 for the new system. Now, this game might not release until 2026 if the holiday Mario game for 2025 is the next 3D entry, and I think a 2025 Super Mario game is likely when you consider that this is the 40th anniversary of the original Super Mario Bros. Game. Nevertheless, I think it's possible that the Next Level Games secondary team could have a title out in the meantime, perhaps a port of Wii Punch-Out. I put a new Punch-Out, or at least a port of Punch-Out, at 10% and another non-Punch-Out Next Level Games title at 10% as well. And then of course, there's Masahiro Sakurai. When he announced he was back in game development, everyone assumed he was talking about Smash Brothers, but it's not necessarily the case. A new game might not release in this time period, but there has been long speculation about the remaster of Kid Icarus Uprising. It's difficult to imagine this game being produced in just a year, unless Nintendo have really hit the accelerator on the project after deciding they weren't going to have new hardware in 2024, but this might explain why Sakurai went from gently supervising to diving right in at the end of last year. I think the absolute chance of a Kid Icarus Uprising remake or remaster by the end of 2026 is 50%, but the chance of it being this year's title is closer to 10%. Slightly easier ports in the 10% category, NES Remake, although this feels like more of a January-February game to me, or Yoshi's Woolly World. Good Feel have produced 2 games recently, but porting Woolly World, which ran on similar hardware to the Switch, at least in terms of power, might not be too big a stretch for them. What about WayForward, who did a wonderful job on one of my all-time favourite games, Advance Wars 1+2 Reboot Camp? If they received the nod for another port after finishing up work on Advance Wars 3 years ago, they could be ready with something new. Wario Land, Chibi Robo. Regrettably, the one project I really doubt they'll be releasing is a new Advance Wars game, which is a crying shame because it's such a great series, and please do check it out. I don't know if they'll have anything this year, but the possibilities from this talented studio are tantalising, even though I'm only going to give it a 10% likelihood. Speaking of beloved but underserved franchises, however, what about Star Fox? Look, I really don't expect Star Fox Zero to be salvaged until it comes to the online service in 2043 for the, I don't know, Nintendo Mind Orb or whatever console they'll be having by then, but some kind of smaller scale Star Fox cameo has precedent. See 2018 Starlink Battle for Atlas tie-in. Also, while Star Fox can be used as a visual crowd pleaser, and those often suit new consoles, the large install base of the Switch would give the dying franchise more exposure. Nintendo is an IP company, and Star Fox is definitely an IP that they, and particularly Shigeru Miyamoto, would like to do more with. The nostalgia wave hitting Top Gun recently probably doesn't hurt Fox's chances, although I don't think that sort of thing bothers Nintendo too much. I think the chances of a mainline Star Fox are only 10%, but that's not the only shot in Pepe's locker. Every now and then we see Nintendo launching unexpected franchise spin-offs, and quite often these come in the later part of console lives. We saw Hey Pikmin on 3DS, Metroid Prime Federation Force also on 3DS, and a Bayonetta spin-off last year. There are a number of Nintendo properties that could benefit from smaller, experimental side games, from smaller ones like Star Fox and Pikmin, to larger ones like Splatoon and Animal Crossing. Therefore, I'd put some kind of spin-off at a 30% likelihood. Of course, there are loads of other possibilities that are in the 10% category. A new Captain Toad, a Sin and Punishment Wii remake, anything Wario related that's not WarioWare, more Balloon Fight. So this is the lay of the land for 2024. There are so many ways to configure this. If they want to make a splash, I'd say they would go with Fire Emblem 4 in July, Zelda: A Link Between Worlds in September, Super Mario Galaxy 2 and Tomodachi Life in October, and a Pokemon Gen 6 remaster in November. Or if they wanted to play the season down a little bit, they could still have a Fire Emblem title in July, which I think is the strongest shout of any of these games. Then Donkey Kong Country returns in September, bearing in mind they really want to big up Donkey Kong to tie into their new theme park ride, and in October, Mario Baseball and Zelda: A Link Between Worlds, before finish off in November with some kind of Pokemon title. To be clear, neither of these are forecasts now, as there are so many factors that the percentage odds of these particular games in this specific combination is now so close to zero that it's almost impossible to imagine I get them all right, but hey, that's the fun of these kinds of videos. Look, as comprehensive as I've tried to be, there is inevitably going to be stuff I've missed, so please let me know in the comments. And while this video has become very highly speculative, please check other videos on the channel which dive a lot more into the research behind these forecasts, and please check back the channel for more coming soon. Thank you very much, take care, and see you next time.